Okay, everybody. I am back again to just say a few opening words for the module, and then I'll have a couple of mind walks that I'll upload this week as well. Probably I'll focus on Karl Marx. My justification for doing that is not just that I'm a left-leaning professor, which is probably what everybody has surmised by now, but it's because I know that we live in a society where Marx's name is thrown around. The ideas of Karl Marx are often thrown around, and Marxism as a system is often talked about. But all of these things with a great poverty of information, people having never actually read any Marx, and just assuming that the few Marxist states, so-called Marxist states that have existed in the world, are perfect representations of what Marx leads to, which is not absolutely the case. And, the same thing can be said about Adam Smith's, who's the quote unquote father of capitalism, who wrote Wealth of Nations. Very few people have read that person. Karl Marx himself read him very closely, but very few people who claim to be capitalists and oppose communism have ever read a single line of Adam Smith. And if they had, they'd realize that just like the communism that has been inspired by certain readings of Marx is often off base and totalitarian, the capitalism that's been inspired by Adam Smith is often off base and almost totalitarian. So, the biggest issue I think that we have when we're studying the political and the social is trying to understand what are the ways that we can think about problems. How are those ways of forming social and political networks uh, already hemmed in by our view of human nature and our view of the metaphysics of reality, right? So capitalism is a particular view of human nature and of reality, and communism is a given view of human nature and reality, and anarchism is a view of human nature and the reality. So this is why we go ahead and look at this, but it's also the reason we've been sort of building up with this background of information. First, we ask, what does it mean to be a human? Then we ask, what is this reality humans find themselves in? And then we actually begin doing a little bit of work, a little bit of talk about, okay, so how can humans finding themselves in a particular kind of reality arrange themselves in a way where the least amount of harm is done to the most amount of people? And unfortunately, all of y'all are getting to live through very interesting times. There's an ancient curse from China that says, may you live in interesting times. I fear that all of us, but especially you youth, have gotten to be born into a very interesting time. And all of you really need to assess not only your view of your assumptions about human nature, not only your assumptions about reality, but also your assumptions about the social and the political. So, basically, then, in our little overview, what we'll focus on for the course is basically what kinds of questions social philosophy and political philosophy can ask. We'll also be looking at why the state is or is not justified. Like, why does the state have its power, and what justifies it having its power? And at what point does the individual have to cede some power to the group and the group trust the individual? These are really big questions that we're asking, right now. We're in the middle of struggling through these things, what's the limit of federal government authority? What's the limit of state authority? How much can city councils do to guide the citizens that they represent in their locale, and how much of that has to be given up to the state, and how much of the state's power has to be given up to the feds, and how much of all of those powers simply cannot be given up 1 inch by the individual or by certain groups. And this is all the things that are going on right now. Rarely do human communities go through periods of uh, overly long peace and tranquility, right? There's always something going on that's requiring some adjustment at least every 2 or 3 generations, right? If a generation is 25-ish years, right, so every 50 years or so there has to be a readjustment, and sometimes that readjustment is one that's fairly conservative, a la uh, what's happened over the last 50 years since 1970. And sometimes that readjustment is fairly liberal. What happened between 1920 and 1970, first with the economic crash. More than likely, so there's some overlapping there, obviously. More than likely, what we're going to see is, as we sort of ponder these ideas of what justifies the state and its power, is that we're probably moving back into a more progressive period, where there'll be an expansion of certain ideas that are new and were not part of the status quo before. This just happens every 50 years. You can, 50 to 60 years, you can look at it and go back and see, right, that it's sort of this constant pendulum swing. Now, I'm not trying to say there's an absolute cycle to history. I'm simply saying, that we're always kind of swinging one way or the other. And a lot of that revolves around the justification of the state, or the unjustification of the state, and whether or not the state is actually representing the best interests of all the people, or it's only representing the interests of a few people. But that, of course, all rests on us having some kind of an understanding of what justice is, right? It's very difficult kind of thing, it seems to me. We need to um, understand how um, we understand justice. So if the first thing we did was understand human nature, and the next, or attempt to begin the process of understanding human nature and what we already think about it, and the next one is understanding reality and what we already think about it. The next is understanding justice and what we already think about it. Is justice the law? Is justice something beyond the law? Can laws be unjust? Can ethics merely be the observation of law, or does a true ethical commitment mean a commitment to justice? And if it's a commitment to justice, what is justice, right? Um, in some ways, the ancients are going to say that an entire possibility of being ethical or moral rests on how justice is understood, right? And certainly one of the most interesting narratives in the Holy Bible of the Christians, that's borrowed from the ancient Hebrew texts, and that has influenced itself on the Quran and other um, Islamic interpretations. So all of the Abrahamic religions. One of the most interesting narratives in there is the narrative of Job, the faithful, but you might also call him Job the just, or the one who hoped in justice, because right. So it's sort of a narrative of, well, what is justice to God, and what is justice to man, and how do we understand just treatment. Okay. Um, and once we've kind of considered this issue of, uh, once we've considered this issue of uh, justice, how we understand justice or engage justice, then we come back again to the state, and we begin to ask ourselves what can be the limits of the state, right? So actually, if a state is going to stay viable, it's become obvious over the course of the last 200 years of U.S. history that if a state is actually going to remain viable, there has to be there has to at least be some notion of civil disobedience. The democracy is going to stay viable, especially. Right? And so there has to be an ability to protest, an ability to disobey, once you realize that some laws and some policies are themselves unethical and dehumanizing. And this is an automatic limit put on the state. Another limit, of course, would be that every human being is supposed to be free, and so there's only so that keeping that freedom in mind, you have to limit the power of the state, and when that does not seem to be working, then there has to be some civil disobedience. There are human rights, and there is a need to be able to defend yourself. So, sometimes it's very weird how, on the one hand, in our society, we can have some of the disagreements that we have, which are mostly based on different, they have a different metaphysical commitment about what reality is. They have differing commitments about what human nature is. They have different ideas of what justice is. And so the state has to be something that allows for that difference of opinion. And if one side begins to become too powerful, then the state may end up in their hands, and that's a fear. Now, I think that it's very important that everybody actually takes the moment we live in right now and tries to determine where you stand on those, and really examine, the roots of your ideas of state limitation and state authorization, how those things are rooted in your sense of justice, your sense of reality, and your sense of human nature. Okay. Uh, go ahead and do your beginning activities for the learning objectives and for the activator video, and have a good time reading and thinking about this stuff this week. We'll have your papers graded by next week. Okay? And not next week, but by the end of this week. All right.